from Heat 1, Rhode Island, Dayton, and UMass on to the grand final. Fordham and Duquesne at Varsity 8 into the petite final. Good speedy first heat, good close heat as well. Dayton gave a good push to Rhode Island, and now we race our second heat of 2 at the women's Varsity 8. 3 of these 4 teams will move on to the grand final. George Mason, George Washington, St. Joseph's, and LaSalle. Let's start with the voting's for George Mason. The Patriots send out Coxon, Paige Hansberry, Stroke, Grace Moody. Marin Hull is in seat 7, Xander Huffman in 6, Emily Donahue in 5, Claire Driscoll in 4, Katia Pedroza in 3, then it's Carolyn Larson and Alia Daniel to round out the lineup for George Mason. George Washington is next to them. The Colonials have won each of the 2 heats that they've been in so far. They are coxswained by Naomi Lee. Catherine Donahue is their sturdy stroke. Kate Donahue taking a 5th year this year, and she's the fastest she's ever been, according to Marcy Robles. Lauren Bennett in seat 7, Maxine Castle in 6. It's Emma Peel in 5, then it's Erin Gramley, Lauren Bolton, Alice Wall, and Kathleen Westover. St. Joseph's next to George Washington. The 2011 A10 champions are coxswained by Captain Shannon Mulgrew, stroked by Captain Shane Devine. Then it's Allison Ruck, Hannah Howard, Captain Corinne O'Neill in the 5th seat, Julia Ianieri in 4, Carly Bakinski in 3, Aislinn O'Brien in 2, and Riley McDade in 1. And then finally, it's LaSalle. This is the lone representative of LaSalle, only fielding an 8 this weekend in the Varsity 8. So for the Explorers, a chance to get some points on the board and wrap up what has been a successful season for them under first-year head coach Jeff Garbett. They are coxswained by Elizabeth Boyle, stroked by Angela Hallenad, Kate Vasey's in 7, Lily Henshaw in 6, Georgia Vaughn is in 5, Sarah Reed is in 4, Kyra Baldassara is in 3, Megan Didinga in 2, and Madison Albanese in 1. One of the interesting things about Sarah Reed in here, novice rower who is in her first year learning to row, already the top erg scorer on LaSalle's team in just her first year rowing. So Jeff Garbett, who was an assistant at Iowa before coming to LaSalle, has been very impressed with what she's done in her first year rowing. So from right to left, you will see George Mason, George Washington, St. Joseph's, and LaSalle. Away for the final preliminary heat. After this race, there'll be about a 40-minute break, and then at 10:30, we'll see the final start. We'll start with the petite final in Varsity 4, and then the grand final in Varsity 4 at 10:50. We'll stick to these 20-minute centers, and by about 12:20 or so, we will be able to name an A10 conference champ. George Washington out quickly. The other 3 teams are just dead even over these first 100 or so meters. So George Washington has about a half-length lead. Then it's St. Joe's, George Mason, and LaSalle with no separation between the 3 boats there for second. Yeah, big race here is going to be between 3rd and 4th. Top 3 get to the grand final. 4th has to settle for a petite final race. George Washington continuing to move the boat well. And now St. Joseph's moving ahead for second. They've picked up a couple of seats on both George Mason and LaSalle. Marcy Robles has said just how proud she is of the commitment her team had this year to keeping themselves, everyone safe, living within the protocols so that they could have a successful season. And, so there were tough moments along the way, but they came together for that goal of working toward a championship. And I can tell you, the way they've rowed so far in these prelims, they are in the mix for a championship when we look to the grand final. Still try to take down the 2-time defending champs from Rhode Island. At 500 meters into the race, it's about a length lead for George Washington. St. Joseph's in second, but only a couple of seats ahead of George Mason for third. At this point, George Mason has a length on 4th place LaSalle. The Patriots looking for their first grand final appearance this week, as they'll be in the petite final at 2nd Varsity 8 and at Varsity 4. Again, I mentioned a lot of these rowers for George Mason living off campus, and some commuting as much as 90 minutes each way to come to row. That is something that Joe Richards said really speaks to the commitment of his team. They're stroked here by Grace Moody, who is what Joe Richards said is the standout rower on this team. Toughest person, called her the hardest worker, and said they would be a whole lot different without her. So super proud of what he's seen from her. Also wanted to point out a couple of the seniors. Carolyn Larson, who is headed to the Arlington, Virginia Police Department after she wraps up her career. She's sitting in the 2-seat. Xander Huffman in this boat, also a senior, heading to grad school at George Mason next year, and she will row for a 5th year with George Mason. So this is not her final event. St. Joe's still in second with George Washington leading the way. St. Joe's has a length now on George Mason for second. Mentioned that Jerry Quinlan was very high on the leadership of his senior captains Shane Devine, Shannon Mulgrew, and Corinne O'Neill in this boat. Said that they were so responsive to individual rowers' needs and concerns throughout the course of the season, really helping their teammates through. And said at the same time, they were able to show a really strong focus to their own skill development, and all three got better as the year went along. That's the Coxon Mulgrew, the Stroke Devine, and the 5-seat O'Neill. They were right about 329 heading through the 1,000 meters, which puts them on a 6:58 pace. The Colonials out in front. That would be absolutely the fastest time so far at the Varsity 8. We saw the winning time for the first heat was a 7:05 from Rhode Island. Now, again, we have seen a lot of these teams that get out in front, like George Washington has here, take it down a notch in the second 1,000 when they have their positioning secured, and that's the smart way to race a prelim. There is no reason to burn out here when you have your grand final race at 12:10, and that is less than 2.5 hours from now. So it's going to be a quick turnaround for all these crews, and that's why you want to make sure you have your reserves. Again, this isn't crazy for any of these teams. They've all raced in regattas this year where you row multiple times in the day, but you still want to be smart about how you approach a prelim. George Washington with open water back to second place, and St. Joseph's. St. Joseph's open water back to third place, George Mason, and then it's George Mason with open water back to fourth place, LaSalle. So with about 500 meters to go, we have our distinct tiers at this point. Let's see where we are on the river at this point. You see the next set of buoys. That'll tell you 500 meters to go for George Washington. 5 minutes have come and gone in this second heat of 2. Saw the last heat, a little bit of lane interference. Teams getting a bit off their line as we have 500 meters to go. Everyone looks good and straight here. So it was the only time we've seen that all day. It seemed like just a little bit of misdirection, but everybody got righted by the end, and expect that to be the case heading toward the grand final as well. It's going to be quite the showdown in those grand finals between Rhode Island and George Washington. These two teams have shown themselves, at least through the prelims, to be the top two with wins in their respective heats. For George Washington, a conference championship would be their first. For Rhode Island, it would be an 8th and a 3rd straight. We got some rogue geese making their way out into the course of the path here. Generally, they're smart enough to see the oars coming and get out of the way. George Washington out in front. St. Joseph's likely on its way to second here. And George Mason still holding off third. LaSalle with some work to do in the final stretch if they're going to jump back up to a grand final. But at this point, George Mason looking comfortably locked into third. So if you want to compare times, again, Rhode Island won the last heat 7:05, 363. Dayton was second, 7:09, 653. Clock at 6:40 with George Washington in that final stretch and coming toward the finishing line. It's going to be a good time for George Washington. Question is, will it be better than 7:05? It's going to be close. Here they come. We're going to have to wait for the official mark, unofficially, right around that 7:05 mark. So very comparable to what URI did in the previous heat, which sets up a really good showdown in the grand final. Here comes a strong second place for St. Joe's. And George Mason claims the grand final spot, taking third. LaSalle will finish fourth and head to the petite final. Waiting to see times come in and see just where George Washington was. It is the fastest time, 7:03.415 for George Washington. So they have the fastest time of the prelims in Varsity 8. Rhode Island ends up with the second fastest time, Dayton third, UMass fourth. St. Joe's in this heat going 7:17.477 with a strong performance to have the fifth best time overall. And George Mason 7:28.923 also moves on to the Varsity 8 grand final, which will wrap up our day at 12:10. So